In this speech, there's a quotation of a letter by Guido Reni, where Reni allegedly wrote: "Vorrei aver avuto pennello angelico o forme di paradiso per formare l'arcangelo e vederlo in cielo, ma io non ho potuto salire tanto alto e invano le ho cercate in terra, sicché ho riguardato quella forma che nell'idea mi sono stabilita." In questo discorso di Bellori, this idea of the ideal form in the mind of the artist is very clear. The artist as the only origin of beauty. The second passage from the 17th, and that's the other image of the St. Michael. Can you see the images? The second passage is about the ideal style for altarpieces and concerns two of the first paintings by Annibale Carracci in Bologna, his Crucifixion and his Baptism of Christ. 83 and 85, 1583, 1585. According to Malvasia, members of the older generation of Bolognese artists guilds reacted to this painting and to the other one, saying that they were in too trivial a manner, that he could well strip a workman or put a drapery over him and copy him bodily onto the canvas, and that this was a style to be practiced in the drawing class, not to be used in an altarpiece, essere quello uno stile da praticarsi nell'Accademia del Nudo, non da servirsene in un quadro d'altare. They censored the method of studiare e vedere figura per figura, suggesting instead of putting down appropriately the whole idea and making use of things already seen and studied. While it's difficult to find similar theorizations of the ideal form or the ideal style in the art theorists of the sacred image before the 17th century, I will argue here that the second half of the 16th century sees a new focus on visual perception and perception conditions in relation with ideals of beauty, on external visual conditions which are considered ideal, and on the opportunities offered to artists to physically develop and represent ideal vision in the space. Illusionism and the external condition of visions, rather than the state of religious piety that allows a certain perception, becomes in this period a condition for the ideal vision. I will try to show that these new developments in the conception and the making of sacred images, rather than being a result of a non-existing, in my opinion, movement towards the creation of a Tridentine or Counter-Reformation style, are a consequence of Renaissance theories, achievements, and discoveries. So I'm speaking about post-Renaissance materials. My paper has two chapters. The first will focus on a little discussed chapter in Gabriele Paleotti, Discorso intorno alle immagini sacre e profane, of 1581, and the second discusses the example of Annibale Carracci in the Salviati Chapel at San Gregorio al Celio in Rome, where the painter was confronted with representing an ideal vision in the space. At first sight, according to the early modern Catholic theorists of the sacred image, the visible forms of the sacred figures, the mysteries, as they called them, and the sacred histories were generally not required to be ideal or absolutely beautiful, as much as true or at least very similar. Giovanni Andrea Giglio, for example, is interested in the vera forma circa la verità dei soggetti che si pingono, not in the ideal form. There are quotations that one could add to this from Giglio, but the point is that vera forma, vera immagine, vera effigies are the concepts that are most repeated. Already in 1957, Federico Zeri noted the absence of any interest, I quote from the book on Scipione Pulsone, verso il linguaggio formale, verso l'idea. There was no interest in this period. However, other writers, for example, Giovan Battista Armenini, are concerned with beauty and ideal beauty in relation to sacred images. To, I quote, "Instead of certe figure fatte alla greca, goffissime, dispiacevoli e tutte affumicate, he prefers le belle immagini painted by Renaissance artists, in particular Titian, Correggio e Giulio Romano, And these are considered to be much more effective because the eye can perceive their divinity quasi come le proprie che sono in cielo. We also find discussions about the notion of perfezione. The theorist who is more interested in discussing with some detail how to make una pittura interamente bella e perfetta is Gabriele Paleotti. Paleotti is one of the few authors who, in shaping his aesthetic ideals for religious pictures, develops not only a parts destruence, but also a positive proposal. According to Paolo Prodi, which is one important historian that has studied Paleotti in Bologna and his impact on art, according to Prodi, the ancient notion of depiction as pure imitation is left behind. Paleotti writes, painting which before, in antiquity, he meant, I think, at just one end, to resemble. Now, in the Christian times, I think, but this before and this now, it's generic in the text, we have to interpret it, takes on a new guise as an act of virtue, and as well as presenting a resemblance, ascends to a greater end, aiming at eternal glory and contriving to recall men from vice and bring them to the true cult of God. However, here we are still in the realm of the function of art, not much in that of the form. More interesting is his point about what is a pittura perfetta. Paleotti writes that in order for a picture to be praised universally, it's not enough to be without defects. Even if a picture is without defects, it cannot be defined as interamente bella e perfetta. A perfect picture is for Paleotti not something ontologically or theologically perfect, or only true, but something that it must please universally, deve soddisfare universalmente, piacere universalmente. This emphasis on the role of the observer is new to this type of literature. It signals a theoretical shift which takes into account the Renaissance development of art theory, which I will skip here for reason of time, an important section of Paleotti in which he recalls and discusses four possible approaches to the ideal of the perfect picture. These four approaches, we can discuss it later, include the Zeusi principle, according the principle of Zeusi, like represented here in this painting at the Casa del Vasari. But I will skip the description of the four modes according to which to Paleotti it's possible to achieve the perfect picture. However, and this is crucial, Paleotti does not consider these principles to be enough. Starting from abstract concepts and mathematical terms, he wants to get to regole particolari che mostrino in pratica più che si può la via che sa da tenere, a ciò le pitture che si fanno meritino la grazia universale. And here comes, in my opinion, the most interesting part. Paleotti wants at least to signal the direction painters should follow. In fact, a painting should not just to accommodate to the sacred subject, like for other writers, but also to its location and public. Paleotti identifies four different typologies of public which look and gaze to sacred images in different ways: i pittori, i letterati, gli idioti e gli spirituali. While the spirituals take pleasure in viewing them, the others, gazing at them and perceiving the dissimilarity to themselves, feel compunction and resolve to heighten their devotion. Even more notable is that Paleotti is the only one who is interested not only in the point of view and disposition of the various types of spectators, but also in the changing condition of the vision itself. As already, he makes a distinction between painter painting and the eye of the viewer. And the principle which Paleotti presents is a new declination of the idea of decorum and accommodatio. To explain it, he refers first to a passage more obvious from St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, in which Paul had to adapt his discourse to the Jews, the Greeks, and other listeners of the Gospels. Secondly, he makes an example which is more unusual, which brings us back to the problem of the ideal vision. Painters of the sacred image should, I quote from Paleotti, struggle as hard as they can to win the mind of every viewer as much as they can. In these Paleotti writes, they should imitate the example of those who, in the West Indies, compose images from bird feathers. They know that these feathers present different colors according to the varying light conditions and are not content for their images to succeed only in the morning light, but desire them to respond as well to the light of midday, of the setting sun, and also to the light of lanterns at night. I illustrate this passage with an unpublished feather mosaic from the Carmelite archive in Rome. But as we know, this type of artifacts have gained a new art historical centrality recently thanks to the works of Alessandra Russo, Gerhard Wolf, and others. However, while it is known that Paleotti did own one of these feather mosaics, which is lost, I think, unfortunately, this passage from his treatise has not been discussed as much as it deserves, because I found it extremely interesting, because instead of showing the influence of Western ideals on feather art, for example, on iconography and other elements, it gives us a hint about the role of this type of new art, the role that this type of new art had on the aesthetic conceptions of Western writers and theorists. More specifically, we can see here how, together with the Renaissance development of art and theory, also the new global context of art did change the idea of ideal form and ideal seeing in the religious field. But it's possible to find parallels of this new focus and on external conditions of the vision in the work of contemporary artists. Let's go back to the case of Annibale Carracci. According to, again, Paolo Prodi, Annibale's crucifixion is to be considered as the birth of the modern altarpiece, with which the Tridentine decree seems to reckon. However, if Malvasia's anecdote I've quoted at the beginning is reliable, at least one class of public, the painters, did not like it at all. Therefore, this not can be considered a perfect image. But in general, I think that the search for the birth of a so-called Tridentine style cannot be, in my opinion, an interesting project. I would like instead to shift the question and ask whether it's possible to find parallels to Paleotti's focus on different publics, points of view, changing condition, and ideal visions in contemporary painting. Reminding the passage where Armenini was opposing certe figure fatte alla greca, goffissime e tutte affumicate, to the belle immagini, I want to discuss a case of compresence of these opposite stylistic modes in Rome around 1600. The Salviati Chapel at San Gregorio al Celio. Let me just recall very briefly what we know and what we still don't know exactly about this place. There's an inscription on the upper frame, subdivided among the four walls of the chapels, and this inscription informs us, that's the inscription, that in the year 1600, Cardinal Antonio Maria Salviati furnished a chapel with the image of the Virgin Mary that, before the year 1000, had spoken to the Blessed Gregory in his parents' house. This indicates the date of the making of the chapel, which was adorned with ancient columns and colorful marbles. The inscription also makes clear that the devotional focus of this space was an image of the Virgin Mary, which was believed to have spoken to Gregory, and that was moved into the chapel on purpose from its original location nearby. In fact, it was believed that San Gregorio al Celio was built on the house of the family of Gregory the Great. We might wonder why this focal image was placed not on the main altar, but on the right wall. A small structural detail, rarely discussed by scholars, offers a possible answer. This extremely ugly, I would say, image of the Virgin Mary is not hanging on the true wall of the chapel, but it's just obliquely embedded in the lateral wall. This obliquity is a characteristic of the original roundish surface of the painting. It's visible also from this other image. Notwithstanding the legendary prestige of this image, the designers of the chapel must have felt reluctant to adapt its odd shape to the main altar. It's probably because of the irregular shape of the old image that the designers of the chapel decided to place it on the right lateral wall so as to look towards the altar. So this image looked towards the altar. In this way, this focal icon was materially transformed in an image to be seen by another image, in an ideal process of reciprocal vision, which was constructed by Annibale in the way I'm now going to briefly describe. Annibale was asked to design a suitable altarpiece, now destroyed, which he must have done between around 1600. Even if the copy remaining in situ is not of good quality, it can still give us an idea about the relation between the two images. This is the view of the Madonna when one stands at the altar, more or less in the position of St. Gregory. These other slides shows how the altarpiece looks from the point of view of the Virgin Mary. Carracci faced the following problem: how to make an altarpiece that had to be at the same time frontal and in dialogue with a focal image on the lateral wall, so a sort of moving image. This chapel really thematizes, I suggest, the various issues related to vision and vision conditions that were relevant at the time. The main character, St. Gregory, which was also commonly considered the first theorist of the religious image, is represented while it looks at a painted image of the Virgin Mary. This alleged ancient icon becomes a vision, and in its turn looks at him. In this sense, I propose that this complex represents the complexities of ideal seeing. Unfortunately, the copy in situ alters important details of the original painting. On the left is a photograph, on the right is a photograph of the copy. On the left, a photograph taken before 1937 of the real altarpiece, which was destroyed in London. So I will use the photograph in black and white for my further comments. Since the pioneering monograph of Donald Posner in 1971, it was possible to study the elaboration of this now destroyed altarpiece thanks to a series of at least 6 surviving drawings, documenting the development in the conception of the painting. Everybody agrees that Annibale wanted to achieve a degree of illusionistic effect. But, however, it's also always repeated that Annibale's first composition was much more free and illusionistic than the final picture, where, I quote from Posner, little remains of the illusionistic ideas with which Annibale started some years before. For Posner, Annibale progressively purged warmth from his work. This reading, that was very influential and authoritative, derives from a general idea of Annibale's late style as a hyper-idealism. Posner called this hyper-idealism, according to which these illusionistic elements were dismissed. Recent scholarship has already changed this view, but in relation to the now destroyed Salviati altarpiece, Posner's description has not been fully challenged, even if, as we shall briefly see, it is in contradiction with all the early modern descriptions of the painting. I hope to briefly show that the evolution in the planning of the St. Gregory altarpiece was related to this special issue of laterality and crossed vision that the painter had to confront in this instance. From Baglione to Bellori to the engraver Jacob Frey, who provided one of the best reproductions of the ancient altarpiece, ancient observers noticed not only the extremely lively colors, but also the effective dialogue between the two images. I cut all the quotations from the ancient viewers, only to quote a later one in the 17th century, when the image of the Virgin received a crown. This was an acknowledgement of a sort of prestige of ancient icons that were crowned starting with 1658. But the justification of this crowning is interesting because it is written in this document, which is preserved in the Biblioteca Vaticana, that one of the reasons, I quote from this document because it's interesting, it's a bit long, but I will be quick. The most prestigious and excellent glory of this most respectable place is the image of Mary painted on the wall, which was in St. Gregory House, etc. This is the image in front of which the devout St. Gregory, from his earliest years, frequently directed to God his fervid prayers. And so they explain why it is important. And at the end of the document, they write, what more, the picture on panel, painted by the famous Annibale Carracci, represents the Holy Pontiff humbly kneeling and praying and with his face turned towards this image. Con la faccia rivolta a questa immagine, it's written in this 17th century document, provides a most effective description of how the interaction between the two images must have looked in 1658. If the dismissal of the efficacy of Annibale's final solution was in part a bias, as I think, deriving from Posner's idea that the late Annibale was a sort of hyper-idealistic painter, because he thought that he was the painter of the Reform, we need to look once again with fresh eyes at the available material to reassess the work for this altarpiece. In fact, the final solution might be only apparently less illusionistic. And I will show you briefly with a series of slides, and then I will conclude. The strong three-dimensional implications of the first drawing are chiefly due to the inclusion of the depicted surface of the entrance arch to the chapel and to the gesture of the angel on the right, which protrudes outside the painted surface, pointing towards the image of the Virgin Mary. The relation between inside and outside is not entirely clear here, and also there's a problem of from a compositional point of view, this double movement, these two pointing gestures, unnecessarily complicated the composition. The shift towards the final composition is documented by a sheet with a series of studies now at Windsor, which is this one. I go more quickly because time is running. This is the final shift towards the final idea. Here, Annibale not only explores the range of appropriate gestures for a listening figure, he also introduces a small but fundamental change to the composition. Here we can see that, I don't know, differently from both the first and the second bozzetto, first bozzetto and second intermediary stage, where the two angels are still standing behind Gregory. In the third drawing, the angel on the right has stepped down towards the image of the Virgin on the adjacent wall. Now he introduces Gregory to her, while at the same time, flying angels and a slightly twisted dove have replaced the unsuitable angels and souls from purgatory that were at the top of the other two drawings. In the bottom left corner, so here, in this corner, the painter studied an alternative gesture to the listening gesture, and finally, in the artist sketched this vignette here, I think, on the far left of the sheet. My hypothesis is that this smaller study represents an attempt to sketch what might have been a lateral vision of the altarpiece when seen from the point of view of the Virgin Mary. So the vignette I show you there. And in the next slide, I've tried to prove my point with a rudimentary collage comparing the small study on the left of the Windsor sheet with a section of the copy altarpiece seen from the point of view of the image of the Virgin. I don't know if you are convinced, but that's my hypothesis. While in the first bozzetto, the plan of the three figures and the corresponding line of the cushion are parallel, this line here is parallel to the pavement. In the final solution, there's the diagonal line. So the line is changed like that. From the lower foot of the angel on the right, who steps before the saints, to the knee of the angel on the left. At the same time, if you look carefully, while the cushion is still parallel to the step of the chapel in the two first models, in the final version, the cushion too is slightly moved, diagonal. All these small but clever changes, together with the decision to eliminate the frame of the chapel in favor of a more direct presentation of the saint to the icon, made the altarpiece, I suggest, more suitable to the ideal interaction between the two images, which was meant to happen across the chapel. I hope to have shown that it's possible to follow the careful process through which Annibale worked out the best solution for the peculiar task of creating a sort of mirroring hierarchy between the two images on the two walls of the chapel. A further point is that Annibale Carracci's lateral altarpiece offered crucial added value to assessing the prestige of the allegedly ancient icon. In other words, the authority of art, the painting created by the celebre Annibale Carracci, and the prestige of the ancient image reciprocally contributed to enhance the value of the ensemble. To conclude, instead of focusing on the idea of Tridentine style, I have tried to argue for a shift in art and art theory and art practice in the post-Tridentine period. The ideal form cannot be disconnected from the ideal seeing, and the ideal seeing in this period has much to do with space, changing conditions of vision, points of view, and illusionism, also exemplified by the example of the feather mosaic given by Paleotti. During the 20th century, it has become a commonplace of an important point of art historical studies to consider works of art in their original context, and especially after 1988, the year of Sherman's Mellon lectures, from the point of view of the spectator. However, it has not been explored so far how much this development, which was particularly relevant in the Renaissance and in the post-Renaissance, has changed the Renaissance and post-Renaissance perceptions of the religious image too. Thank you very much. Sorry if I was more long.